Chelsea Erickson, the youth ministry editor for Rooted and the pastor of youth and families at First Congregational Church in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. And I'm just really glad that you all have joined us today. If you're just jumping on, hello, we're so excited to have you. Our vision here at Rooted is really to transform youth ministry so that every student receives a grace-filled, gospel-centered, and Bible-saturated discipleship in the church and the home. And this has been such a strange time for all of us as youth ministers, and we've been physically distant from the students we shepherd. And I think, trying to give them a grace-filled, gospel-centered, and Bible-saturated discipleship, but doing so in radically new ways that we never anticipated. So now here we are, as we were just speaking about our panelists, with many states opening up a bit and the warm weather kind of allowing us to gather outside for the first time in many months. And I think a lot of us are just really eager to get our students together. So today we want to talk about how to do this in safe, engaging, and gospel-centered ways. And if you saw our Ask Rooted post on the blog last week, you know that members of our Rooted community have lots of great ideas about how to gather with students in these smaller groups this summer. And so as we talk today, we want to hear from all of you as well, just knowing that you'll have great input and ideas and questions. So if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to type those into the comment section as we're talking and having this conversation. And then toward the end of our time together, we hope to brainstorm a little bit as a whole group, and we'd love to include you in that. So this is, although it's a Zoom call, some of us are really zoomed out at this point, but this is a little bit different. What you'll need to do is use the raise hand feature, and we can unmute you if you'd like to vocalize a question or a comment brainstorming. Please note that our conversation is being recorded and may be published later as a podcast and a video. So if you'd rather just use the chat, we're fine with that too, but we'd love to include your literal voices if you feel comfortable speaking up. So I want to introduce our panelists. Joining me today are my friends Kendal Conner and Skyler Flowers. And if you read our blog, and I really hope you do, then you probably know these two by their writing. They are both just really prolific and thoughtful writers in our ministry, and they're also incredible ministers of the gospel. So I'm excited for you to hear from them today. Kendal is a Rooted Steering Committee member and the group's minister at Redeemer Fellowship in Kansas City, Missouri, where she now works with women primarily. She's had a decade or more of youth ministry prior to that. But this is kind of, this is really in her wheelhouse, talking about groups that are launching this summer. And then Skyler Flowers serves as student ministry director at Orlando Grace Church in Orlando, Florida. And he is currently pursuing an MDiv at Reformed Theological Seminary. So, even among the three of us, we have some geographical differences in our context in terms of what our states will allow. So I hope that can be kind of part of our conversation today. But Kendal and Skyler, let me just open it up by asking, what are some of the unique opportunities of this unusual season when we think about meeting with students, sharing the gospel of grace with them, rebuilding community? If you could just both talk about that a little, it would be great.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's my favorite kind of thought process to put into it, is what are the opportunities that we have in this season that we haven't had prior to this season. So we all know that in student ministry, summers are typically, they are the gold of the year. They are what gives us a lot of relational capital with our students. They give us a lot of just really great experiences. And so it can seem almost daunting to think of what's being taken away. But in reality, what is being offered, I think, is even more exciting in the ways that we can kind of reshape and reform some of the ministries that we have. So when I was thinking about this, I don't know if you guys read, there was an article that was released by Alan Hirsch, and he gave this analogy of how when you're playing, he was talking about when he was learning how to play chess. The guy that was teaching him how to play actually took his queen off of the board, removed her from the board, and said, until you learn how to play the game and win without the queen, we won't put the queen back. And the idea was that he was giving him, teaching him how to use this holistic game, because I know very little about chess, so I'm not trying to act like I do, but I know that the queen is one of the most valuable players, right? She can move in any direction. She has a lot of power. So by removing her, he had to learn how to utilize the ways in which the other players on the board actually serve the game. And so Alan was kind of making this analogy of, as a church, we've lost our queen in losing our Sunday gatherings. And I think as student ministers, we've lost our queen in losing like what our summers usually are. But the opportunity that we have is to see the ways that the other things that we can do can actually empower and embolden the ministry to our students in ways that we've not used them before, because we've utilized these larger gatherings like camps and mission trips and things like that. So I think our opportunity is to see how can the ministry fall into the hands of our leader, our volunteer leader more, our student leaders more. What are the ways that these smaller gatherings can actually empower those ministries? I think that's the huge opportunity we have in front of us. And then when we put the queen back on the board, it'll be way more powerful than it has ever been.
I love that. That's such a great analogy.
Yeah, Kendal, that was great. And I would especially want Kendal to go first, because I know she wrote a really good article, I think last week, that was addressing some of the opportunities, and I read it. And so it even shaped some of the ways that I'm thinking through this question. But one of the things that I think about, what are some of the unique opportunities in this season? I'm especially thinking about, so there's studies that show that for millennials, some of the things that have shaped their thinking in the way they relate to finances, in the way they relate to the world, and the way they relate to just society as a whole, has largely been shaped by two major events. And that is 9/11 and the financial crisis in 2008. And there's all these sociologists that look at these two moments and they say a lot of the things that you see shaping the lives of millennials, and even to a lesser degree, or to somewhat of a degree, the generation underneath them, is that these two events completely changed their lives, even in ways that they probably weren't aware of at the time. So I can think even in my life, in those moments, I probably wasn't super reflective in thinking about how to process them. But nevertheless, the news media or the way my parents reacted or the way my church reacted were major shaping influences in the way that I viewed the world, not just the way I viewed my life or America, but the way I viewed the entire world. It really is a worldview shaping event. And so as we look at our students, I really truly believe that 2020 will stand out as a moment that for kids that are ages, 3rd grade through 12th grade, these are going to be major worldview shaping events. And that's both coronavirus and George Floyd's death and the subsequent, and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and the subsequent protests surrounding their death. These are going to be worldview shaping events. And so just thinking of unique opportunities, I'm sure everyone that's an attendee and even probably some of us panelists may have different opinions on the way that we should react and the church should react to these things. But nevertheless, if these things are going to be so shaping in the lives of our students, then the gospel has something to say. And ministers have something to say in stepping into these events. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, later on about what that message may be or what that may look like. But nevertheless, some of the unique opportunities is that if they're confronted with worldview shaping events, then we have to confront them with the worldview shaping gospel. And so I think that's really important at this time.
That's so poignant. I mean, just as you're saying that too, I'm thinking about the tension between, all these really significant watershed moments going on for us, and especially for our students. And yet we've been distant from them physically and having to rethink how to reach out to them with the gospel of grace, how to speak into their lives, how to do relational discipleship. And so I don't know about for you all, I would assume that your experience is similar to mine. It's just felt really disorienting. And at times I've felt kind of angry about that. Like I want to do my job well. I want to serve these kids. I want to shepherd their families. And we're having to reinvent the way we do everything. So I think the combination of those things has been really kind of exhausting and tough. And yet here we are, I think what's exciting just for these few weeks of summer that we have before us, maybe for you all who are further south, you have, and especially you in Florida, Skyler, you've got that window for more of the year than we do here in New England. But just seems like we've got this moment where we can lean in and be physically present with kids and process some of the things you're talking about, Skyler, which I think is really powerful.
Well, and what I was thinking, I remember what I was thinking was that for these events that are going on, this is maybe, I mean, I can't think of any other time, even in my life, where everything was totally shut down. The normal rhythms of life are completely disrupted. You know, for me, growing up in South Mississippi, Katrina was kind of like that, because our normal rhythms were disrupted, but it was only for about a month. And, you know, for others, it was much longer. But then with this is completely disrupting their rhythms. And then in the midst of disrupted rhythms, there's these other events that are going on throughout the nation. So whether they're consciously thinking or not, there's questions that need to be answered in their lives that they're thinking, why is this happening? What is truly going on? Who do I even believe? What's a trustworthy source? I mean, there's things that are from as large as, why would God allow such things to happen in the world? And even things as small as, who do I even believe to trust during this time? And so I think that especially now, youth ministers, maybe more than any other time, it's especially important that we speak into these moments.
Yeah. So well said. So, I mean, as we think about that, all of what you've both said about just kind of the opportunities, the unique opportunities of this moment, what do you think? I mean, I'm kind of making the assumption that in most places, small group gatherings are the way we're going to be going, right? Like you said, Kendall, I mean, most camps are shut down. We can't do our mission trips. We've already had a webinar to discuss. There's just so much can't right now. We can't do that. We can't do, in my area, we can't, I don't think I can even take kids to play mini golf or go get ice cream right now. I mean, really, we're so limited. So we're kind of making this assumption that in most places, small groups are going to be where it's at, which in some ways is kind of the bread and butter of youth ministry when you strip it all down. So what do you think are the things that youth workers should be really prioritizing in that kind of stripped down model?
Yeah, I think what's really huge in this season too is kind of what Skyler was even mentioning just a second ago, in that because of how many voices are kind of into our students, and what you were expressing, Chelsea, of like this tension that we're feeling of all these things are happening, yet we have less face time with our students than we ever have. What is true of that is that we are actually, like, for our students especially, it's been happening over the years with Gen Z, like it's slowly been stripping away, but it was kind of in the course of no time at all of a sudden, the sense of belonging has been lost, or it has shifted. Let's put it that way. The center of belonging has shifted for our students. No longer does, the youth group serve as this place where I want to belong because I want to know somebody when I walk into the church building, or I want to have a friend when I go to camp. So like I want to belong. So it's kind of taking that value assessment of what do our small groups exist for? What do our ministries exist for? And how can we empower those in such a way that this is a place that's more, but I think that's beautiful. Like it's more than about just belonging to a group of people, but it's about coming in together for the sake of the gospel, for this place to find the meaning that we're so desperately searching for, that our students are so desperately searching for. So to me, that's been the biggest question, is like, what has brought our students into the church before, has brought them into the ministry before, may not be what brings them in this summer, but there is something that they're longing for. It's not that sense of belonging in the same way they can sit on their couch and belong to a group of people via social media, right? But it's a sense of meaning that they're trying to make out of what is happening around me, what is going on, how do I make sense of this? So that's where I think small groups is like our huge pivot in that. The thing that we want is that they would know this is the place where you're going to not just like belong to a people, but you're going to grow as a people. Like you're going to grow together as a group. You're going towards the same objective, where that's like, whether that's studying scripture and being in the park together that way, or if you're still having to be on Zoom to do that. But I think that that's the huge direction that like we focus on is, man, if the gospel's ever needed, like Skyler's saying, it's now more than, it's like they need it now. They need to understand that now. And that's what's going to bring them into a place more than just, how can we have fun? How can they feel like they belong? Like that's kind of been shattered in a way. So the gospel is what speaks.
Yeah. And I think even in moments, even in my own life, that there's so few times whenever it's like, you're so removed from community and from people that you really begin to feel that longing. Because every week I'm meeting with my church, every week I'm meeting with my students, maybe multiple times a week. And I think for a lot of people I mean, you mentioned Chelsea at the very beginning about being zoomed out. I mean, I'm one of those people, I feel zoomed out, right? I'm pretty sick of having to meet with my community groups and, playing games with students over, because I'm like, gosh, I just wish we could be in person. And so into that, we could say there's a reason for that. There's a reason why we feel that need and that desire to be in person. And so I think what we're really feeling in those desires is a desire for relationships, and we can maintain those over digitally. And I think that's super important. And we're truly blessed to have the opportunity to do that, whereas other generations maybe would not have been able to do so. But nevertheless, so for me, when I think of what's a unique emphasis that we're going through in summer, is we're just looking at relationships and being like, okay, if the things that we could normally rely on to build relational capital, such as games or camps, if those things are being stripped away, then all that's left is the nature of the thing. And the nature of the thing is that what we're hoping to do, even in games and camps and whatever it may be, is we're hoping to build relationships. And so as we approach the summer, the thing that we'd be like, okay, this is a chance to restart. This is a chance to renew. And what we're hoping to restart and renew it is these relationships and approaching them from a different way. Because if we're feeling zoomed out, imagine how our students are feeling who go to school every day with their friends and they haven't seen them in months, or go to church weekly and they haven't seen them. I still am, as an adult, I'm able to see people a little maybe more frequently or have the access to Zoom, and they're not. And so I think one of the things we've been really emphasizing, I think Kendal so greatly put it, was just we've been really looking at relationships. And I think we'll talk a little bit about what that makes more specifically look like.
Yeah. Isn't it ironic? I mean, I'm just thinking, as both of you were talking, Kendal, you brought up Gen Z, and Skyler, as you're talking about this like huge void in our students' lives. I mean, it's so ironic that all the research about Gen Z has been, has emphasized their media use, right? And their Jean Twenge talks about how they're staying at home more than any adolescent generation in history, for as long as adolescence has been studied as its own kind of age and stage. They're staying at home more than any adolescents before them. And now here we are, their school is on Zoom, their youth groups are on Zoom, everything has moved online, and they're craving being in person. So I think, and then in a similar way, like some of the older folks in our church have newly discovered Zoom and some of the online platforms. And, I think they're sick of it too, but they're appreciative of it. So it's kind of been a neutralizer this time, where we acknowledge that technology is very good, but cursed. It's, it has its pluses and we're really thankful for it. And at the same time, it's not the same as being embodied together. So I think that's really thoughtful, just an emphasis for us this summer to really emphasize being embodied people. And helping our students understand, like you said, Skyler, why they crave that. It's because God made us with bodies and they matter to him.
I would encourage, it's so hard to talk, as we were talking about this earlier, it's hard to talk concretes in a lot of things, because everybody's geographical area is going to determine a lot of what you can and can't do. But yeah, the emphasis of how can we, with what restrictions we do have, bring somewhat embodied experience, because that's the challenge of Zoom for our students, is that it is the physiology of our bodies, is that as I'm sitting here on the screen with you, there was a quote, and I forget who said it, but we're in the presence of each other's absence. And that's what's exhausting. It's easier to be absent from one another or present with one another than it is to be in the presence of each other's absence. And that's what's exhausting. So it's good to have this combination of how can we continue to do things online to help those who can't be with us, but just in whatever context, what are ways that, even if it's one-on-one or three, or, if it can be a group of 10 or 50, how can we get that embodied experience? Because that's something that we all need right now in this season, especially.
Yeah, I love that quote. I think that was Liz Edrington's other counselor friend.
Yes, somebody. Yeah, I was I can't remember the name. But
I wish we could share it here. I don't have permission, but it totally gave me chills, and the part you said about it especially. Well, okay, so y'all thinking about these different, you brought up the contextualization piece, Kendal. I think that's a really important point. The three of us here just represent three different contexts. largely really suburban in just different states, right? So hopefully we'll have some participation from our attendees, also sharing their experiences and their context, which may be different. But what are your churches making plans to do for students this summer? Maybe we can just share about that, as this isn't like, it's not meant to be prescriptive, it's meant to be descriptive, right? So here's something you could do if your state allows, and maybe that'll help foster some conversation too.
Yeah, for the most part, so Florida opened up probably a little, I don't want to say prematurely, but a little more than I know that Massachusetts has, and I'm not sure about Missouri. But Florida opened up, and so churches have begun to meet again and everything. And so one of the things we've been doing is we've actually started meeting again as a Bible study. And I know as Chelsea talked about, I mean in person, and as Chelsea mentioned the different contexts, I think what are the two contexts that you guys what are you guys doing, just real brief, in meeting? Are y'all totally unable, a little bit, or what's going on with you guys?
Yeah, we can meet in large, depending on outside and inside determines how large the groups can be gathered in, but we are able to meet in person. So no, like even for us, our students, we're not meeting as a big student ministry, but they're meeting with their small groups throughout the summer, and kind of determining, because as I'm sure you're going to say too, in that, like, depending on the families you're dealing with, some families it's not safe for them to be back with people yet, or maybe they're uncomfortable with that. So there's kind of a combination, but we can meet in person if the numbers are right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for us, no surprise, just based on where we are geographically and how hard we've been hit. We're in a more cautious situation still. So we actually have a meeting with our elders tonight to vet some plans that have been, proposed and that have already been carefully vetted by medical professionals. But we're looking at basically only outdoor gatherings for the summer. And, that doesn't seem like great for the fall, makes you wonder, like, what are you going to do in fall in New England? I guess get some heaters and maybe try to keep meeting outside. But so we're hoping to start student small groups at the end of the month, or I guess early July, right after the 4th. So we're tracking, I think, with the same ideas that your churches are, but we're a few weeks behind as far as launching.
Yeah, and so just in regards to what are some things we can do in the summer, Chelsea's original question. So I think just in regard, and we'll talk a little bit more about some safety precautions and things later, but we've been meeting as a Bible study, but everything's pretty much been outside. So some of the activities that we've done is we've done activities, but especially for some of the families that are a little more cautious, nothing that involves any kind of contact, nothing that involves, and I think Chelsea even mentioned this the other day, we were talking about, getting, where the students are getting to the point of heavy breathing, and, then they're projecting more particles into the air. And so what we've actually been doing is we've just been, okay, as we meet as a Bible study, our chairs are separated, they're 6 feet apart, and we're figuring out games that can actually be conducive to that and stuff, to still be able to maintain that aspect of we're meeting together, we're in relationship with one another, but there's also, we're having some fun. And so we played like games like Mafia or Salad Bowl, which involves, charades and password and catchphrase and everything. And we've looked at towards the end of the summer, maybe being able to do something like a park day and doing something. But honestly, the thing that all of us have to keep in mind is the wisdom aspect, is that as this is a constantly changing situation. I think we have a question in the Q&A that's just kind of about that. That's just a little bit about how do you adjust to, a second wave, or how do you adjust to this? And I think that the thing we have to do is everything we plan for the rest of summer, and really through, I think until 2021, is we have to have everything with an open palm of saying from week to week, this could change. I mean, for instance, our church has actually started meeting again in person. Florida opened up and they're saying this is okay. I mean, restaurants are open up, they can have 50% capacity. And so we've been meeting on Sunday morning, but we've had like 2 services. The numbers have to be this much, you got to be this distance and everything. But then there was a huge spike this past week. And so with there being a huge spike, and it's not going down, it's just continuing to spike, we canceled the second service because there were a lot of people pulling out. So that affected the way when our Bible study time was. So we had to move it. I mean, that's a week. So literally right now we're on a week to week basis. When are we going to meet? What are we going to do at that meeting? And how is it going to look like? And so it's not always comfortable to be in that place of a constantly changing, constantly having to move Bible studies. But I think parents understand that. I think students understand that, and especially maintaining an open line of communication with how you're thinking through these issues and how you're planning to move this is really crucial during that time. But yeah, I mean, that's where we're at right now. Is this past week, we've been meeting for 2 weeks, which was when we opened 2 weeks ago. And then now we're already back to moving things around, changing things up because the situation is constantly in flux.
Yeah. It's not easy. So, you mentioned, Skyler, communication with parents and kids about that. What does that look like for you to partner? And I think, Kendal, we had talked about this a little bit too, like, so maybe you can chime in too, but what's kind of the spectrum of people's comfort look like, and how have you navigated that?
Yeah. I don't know how it is in your guys' groups, but for our group, it's been a huge spectrum. And we have people on one side of the spectrum that are totally like, we should have never stopped meeting. It's totally okay. We just need to trust the Lord in this. And then we have people on the other side of the spectrum that are like, hey, I have pre-existing conditions, or I think, I've been reading medical journals and we need to completely be in quarantine even more. And so we have in our group, which is a fairly small group, we have a huge spectrum of people. And so trying to meet I don't know the right word, trying to meet the desires of those two groups, meet in the middle there is pretty challenging. But I think the thing that we've been trying to emphasize, especially as I communicate with them, because they're not necessarily so much in communication with one another about the plans and everything, but as I communicate with them, I'm trying to always assume the best, assume that their hearts are the same heart that we have, is that they want their students to grow in Christ during this time. They want their students to be influenced by the Bible, and they want their students to be with other students. And that's the same for the person that's like, no, we need to totally be in quarantine. And that's the same for the family that's like, no, we should have never stopped meeting. So meeting in between those two poles is pretty challenging. But nevertheless, like I said, it's keeping that open line of communication about everything that's going on, being on the phone with them, exchanging emails, exchanging texts, making sure that they know that they're heard and actually hearing them, and then continuing to meet in the middle there. And so that's what we've been doing. Is we've been, there's some people that for the people that are like, we should never stop meeting, they're like, we'll just meet inside. We live in Florida. It's really hot. Don't get me wrong. I wish we could meet inside. But then also for the family that's like, hey, I have a pre-existing condition and we're very concerned about this. We're like, sorry, we're going to serve them by continuing to meet outside, because there's a significantly less likelihood that someone can catch it based off the science, that because of the way that the particles are weighed down by the humidity and the heat. So we'll continue to meet outside to serve this family, but nevertheless, we're still going to meet. And that's what all of us are hoping for. And so keeping that open line of communication is super important. But like I said, maintaining the wisdom and the grace to say, we can differ on this, and we can, but also at the same time, maintain fellowship. It doesn't have to be an issue that we divide on so significantly that, hey, we're not keeping our kids out of this. And so keeping that gracious mindset going into the conversation, I think, is super important.
Yeah. One thing we've done to listen in that regard, and just to gather some data without, I think it's tricky in those decision-making processes where it's like, you can't like hear everyone's opinion adequately, but you want to include them in the decision-making process. And so one thing we did was send out a 5-question survey that through SurveyMonkey. We actually did this as a whole church, and then I did one that was just for our middle and high school parents to vet kind of the small group idea and to find out what they'd feel comfortable with. And I even asked a question about playing active games, because I knew that we had some youth leaders who were really hoping we'd be able to do that. And so I figured it would be helpful to have the data of parents saying like, no, we really don't feel comfortable with that yet. So we use that as a way to hear from people what they personally would feel comfortable with, and to gather data about each individual family, kind of just where they were with, would they send their kids or would they not? And that helped us in our decision-making process. So that's one idea that maybe could be helpful for others too. Lifeway published a survey for churches that helped us kind of format those questions. So maybe we can share that in the resources section. Let's see. I want to keep us moving forward here. This is so good, y'all. We have lots to talk about. Kendal, we mentioned at the beginning, your new job, you're relatively new in this role, is all about leading and facilitating groups. So, as we've talked about, it's harder to build community with kids without being able to do the things that we've always done, eat together, play active games, some of those standbys, even go to camp. What are some tricks of the trade that you could recommend for youth workers as they try to rebuild this sense of community in these small groups?
Yeah, and I would say I want to go ahead and caveat from the beginning. I know how, like I said, very different we're working as far as like we probably have student pastors on here who don't have very many volunteer leaders or active parents, and we have some who have a lot of those things to kind of take from resource-wise. But as we've considered small groups, the biggest thing that we've been looking at in this season is, like I said, just kind of how are we giving the ministry into the hands of the individual. So one of the questions that we've been asking a lot, the article that Skyler mentioned earlier, was just kind of thinking, we tend to hold on just by human nature to the things that we know, right? And the things that we've always done. But even as we've mentioned in this time so far, we're actually working within 2 generational ideas here. So like what we have done in student ministry that has worked really well for pastors who are working with millennials is not going to be the same thing that works really well for Generation Z, just by nature of being influenced by different things, growing up in different contexts. And so I think now is the season and the time for us to be able to pause. Like we've been given an intentional pause by the Lord where we can say, like, he's taking that queen off the board, where, the things that we've always done, the things that we've kind of just continue to do because they've worked well in the past, or they're things that we love, like they're not bad things, but we get a chance to actually reevaluate them this summer. And so that's what we've kind of kept our emphasis on small groups for the purpose of saying, okay, if we have nothing else, like if everything else is taken away, what does it look like to embody the work of the ministry within the lives of our people? And that can be our students too. Like, how are they being given opportunities to be the ones discipling their peers, or to be the ones ministering to their peers? So small groups can take place. Like for us, like I said, Missouri has opened up. They slowly started doing the phases, and we've entered into one of the last phases, and we're able to meet in person if we feel comfortable with that. Our church is not meeting as a whole yet, but our small groups, we're encouraging them to be the ones that are doing it. So on Sunday mornings, we're encouraging people to meet in small groups in their homes, to do the worship together, to be able to do fellowship together, to take a meal together, to not lose that sense, but to just do it in the smaller context until we see, because I think that that's, the reality is we've got a long haul ahead of us, right? Like we're not, even as we talk about how are we going to make the summer work, like we're looking at the ministry for the next potential year of, if a second wave comes in, if there's things that have to shut down again. So I think that the encouragement being, how can, if you have small group, if you already have your students into small groups, how can you embody the ministry in the summer in those small group settings? So what are ways that you can encourage them to either meet in person? For some of them, it may be meeting on Zoom, but I would still encourage like doing the embodiment even on Zoom. How can you actively embody the meeting on Zoom and not just expect a middle schooler to sit in front of a screen? But what are things that you can do where they're physically touching something, or they're holding something, or they're being active in it? But giving it over, like releasing some of that over to our leaders and to our students, and just seeing, like, this is the chance to see what the Lord can do in that, where we've kind of held a grip onto it. What would it look like for us to release Bible study into the hands of our students in small groups this summer? We all want the relational, but what would happen if we as ministers kind of pulled back from being the center of relation and allow the center of relation to be amongst our students and those smaller groups? So yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing, is just resourcing, caring for our small group leaders, and then letting them do the ministry of the people with the people, as we kind of just sit back and see what the Lord is doing, what he's teaching them.
That's great. I mean, I even think about things like for student groups, like, assigning a student to take attendance.
Yeah.
Which obviously has to be done, in our context, at least, we're doing that really carefully right now, because we want to have a record of who was with whom in case there's an issue. Or things like, somebody taking responsibility to write down prayer requests. I feel like there are, like, even on a small scale, like jobs that students could be given that would give them increased ownership and a sense of like I have a role to play here, which
Well,
could be really powerful.
and I was listening to I forget her first name, her last name is Anderson. She's one of the group's ministers out of the Church of the City in New York City. But she was talking about these like small groups in this time, digitally, all of that. But she referenced Priya Parker, who writes for the New York Times. And Priya talks about in gatherings, one of the most important roles is kind of that sub-host role, the one who is not technically responsible, but who feels a sense of ownership for how well the meeting goes. And so what does that look like for us to do that with our students, to give them these sub-host roles in their small groups this summer, where maybe at camp, it was all about giving them, like doing camp for them. How can they do like the ministry for themselves instead of us just doing it for them, allowing our students to figure out, being the one who's over praying, being the one who, if somebody's not there, they're going to be the one who texts and calls them. If you're on Zoom, who's in charge of like the chat and who can respond to them, like giving away the little pieces to let it be a holistic view of these small groups with our students, instead of feeling like we have to kind of give them it all. I know it will tire people out, but the people who grab hold of it, man, it like bringing them back together, how sweet is that going to be when we're back together and we all feel this ownership that we didn't feel before?
That makes me think of, there's a great article, I'll see if I can find it and link it to the post, where this is put up online later. But Sharon Ketchum, who's a youth ministry professor here in where I live at Gordon College, wrote an article about youth ministry as service provider rather than as ministry where students are serving with, where students are being actively called into leadership in the local church. And I feel really passionate about that, because if our jobs are really to help form students for lifelong faith in Jesus, part of that is helping them learn how to serve and contribute now. We can't expect that they're just always going to be receiving a service from us and then one day they're going to magically take ownership of it. We have to be entrusting that to them now. So that's great. I think that's such a good tip for this season in particular. So we just have a few more minutes here before we want to kind of shift into brainstorming mode with all of our attendees, participants. But Skyler, I wanted to ask you, we mentioned Kendal's great article. I'll read the title of it so y'all can go find it if you haven't read it. Her article was called Reopening Your Youth Ministry, Questions to Consider, and it was excellent. And Skyler, you wrote one that we published just last week on the blog called Starting at the Beginning, Studying Genesis as We Reopen. So I wanted to just ask you to talk for a minute, and Kendal, feel free to chime in too. But, without spoilers, if people haven't read it, can you tell us a little bit about how you'll structure your Bible study to engage students, and just about the content of what we teach and how that can factor in to these small group experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chelsea. So I mean, anytime we think about teaching or preaching or Bible studies, we obviously want to give them a healthy dosing of the word, and we want to give them the word, but we also want to give them the word within their specific context, within the culture, within the situation that they're meeting in. And so a lot of times when we're just in normal rhythms, that's how do they interact with their parents and their siblings and their friends and their school? How do they deal with the temptations that come along with that? Well, right now their context is largely the home, and it's largely one in which they're being confronted with cultural factors, which we mentioned earlier. And so one of the ways that we've really tried to look at the Bible study this summer is, and one of the reasons that we're really starting with Genesis is that when we're confronted with these huge worldview shaping events, Genesis is the worldview shaping event of the Bible. I mean, really. And, I don't want to get too much into the specifics and everything, but it tells us who their creator is and what this world was meant to be like. And it also establishes why the world is the way it currently is. And it also establishes where the world is headed. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is teach the Bible, but at the same time, we're teaching the Bible, but we're applying it specifically to the situations and the questions that they're confronted with right now, even if they're not asking those questions of us, because I guarantee that they're asking them within themselves. And so we do want to give them the space to ask those questions. One thing that I'm always trying to emphasize is that one time when I was in college, I was in a philosophy of religion class. And my professor just asked, who grew up in a Christian home? And it was like 90% of the room had grown up in a Christian home. And then he asked some question. I can't remember. It was, how many of you felt comfortable in those situations asking questions? And no one raised their hand. And as he drew out of, this is not a Christian college. I went to a secular university, public university. Whenever he began to draw out of these students their stories, it was always things like, I always wondered, this huge question. And then when I talked to my pastor about it, my pastor said that, it wasn't an attitude of faith to ask that question, or when and it was story after story of that. And so, which broke my heart, because I'm just sitting here thinking, if we believe that all truth is God's truth, we believe deep down in our hearts that God truly did create the world, then we should not be afraid of large questions. In fact, we should embrace these questions. And right now, these are questions. I mean, some of these students may have family members that died due to coronavirus. Some of them may be keenly feeling the tragedies that we're seeing from the death of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. They may be keenly feeling the pain of those situations. And if we're not stepping into those situations with gospel truth, but also applying those things to what the Bible's answers to those are, then we're really going to be missing the boat. And so giving them space and letting them know it's a safe space to ask questions, but also answering the questions even if they're not asking them. And just assuming that those are the questions that they really are thinking about. But as we're going through Genesis, I don't also want to just supply the answers. I want them to be able to look at the text and draw these out for themselves. So just as we've started going through Genesis, just asking really basic questions that are, what does this text tell us about God? What does it tell us about God's intention for the world, or anywhere you may be, even if you're in a gospel? What does this text tell us about Jesus? How is Jesus relating to these people? How does Jesus relate to those that are the lowest in society, the weak in society? And just getting them to answer basic questions like that, because if they're clear and evident in the word, then they'll be able to work towards these conclusions without us supplying the answers. And that is a far more powerful aspect of Bible study than if we just say, here's the truth, here's what it means to be the image of God. But if we're walking them through, for instance, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where we get this view of God creating man, and it's this global, in the midst of this global cosmic creation, then Genesis 2, there's this far more personal, relational God that's spoken of in his covenantal personal name, Yahweh. That's a totally different image of how we conceive of the image of God in man. And that's going to shape the way that they view these people dying, these people getting sick, and these tragedies of injustice. These are hugely important things, but walking them through the process of seeing it for themselves will be super crucial in doing that. So some of the ways that we structure is just reading the text, giving them time to think through the text themselves, and then simply asking questions and helping facilitate that conversation to where they're drawing conclusions for themselves. And then tying back to what Kendal was saying in the last question, that's going to lead to the point where these students will be able to lead these same type of Bible studies for other students. And then maybe that's 5 years from now, where you're talking about, this is a 9th grader who's picking up these tools along the way. But by the time they're a 12th grader, they'll have had these tools so down pat that they can lead others in that as well.
That's so good. I mean, as you were talking, Skyler, I was just thinking about, I think Fuller Youth Institute a couple of years ago had a blog post where they talked about a posture of, you can ask that in your youth ministry. And it just strikes me that that's the confidence. I think what you're saying is that's the confidence we want students to have in the word as well. That, you can ask that. You can bring your big questions, and God is not annoyed at you because you're doubting or because you need some answers here. Like, he's open to that, and his word addresses these things that are on your mind and heart. So I think that's just so powerful. I mean, always at Rooted, one of our pillars is theological depth through expository Bible teaching. And so we just always want to emphasize that God's word is powerful, that he's given it to us as the revelation of himself, and that it's our joy and our privilege really to unpack that with students. So the games and all that stuff is great. We want to build community for sure, but we really want to encourage you to be in the word, as Skyler's just shared with your students this summer.
And how sweet is that to think? Because I think if there's one thing that this coronavirus has exposed in all of us, is just how much we've allowed, we don't know how to feed ourselves, even our adults, right? Or the students, we know how to come and to receive, but these are really showing when it's all stripped away and we're stuck at home, the places that we don't actually know how to ask those questions or to feed ourselves. And so I love hearing that, Skyler, because that's training your students. You don't know if coronavirus will hit again, or if there's something else that will separate us, and to be able to know how to be ready for those moments and to stand. That's the resilient disciples we want to see our students become, right?
I love that, resilient disciples. Well, one last question for y'all, and then those of you who are participating with us today, we'd love for you to chime in with your questions or also your ideas for meeting with groups. And I think we had one question about games that maybe we can answer after this together. But it just strikes me, I felt so exhausted sometimes during this season, and so much pressure to be entertaining and creative and all of these things that I don't feel like I am, in order to kind of keep the wheels turning on our youth ministries. And I would guess that's the experience for many people on this call today, many of our colleagues in youth ministry across the country and around the world. So how, in the midst of that exhaustion and all that pressure, do y'all have any words of wisdom about how youth ministers can saturate themselves in the gospel and really be leaning into the rest that Jesus offers?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think just the words of Hebrews 10:25, not neglecting to meet one another, to encourage one another, to build one another up into good works. I mean, we can't be together, but we can still neglect to meet together, even if that is virtually. And so I know one thing that's been crucial for me is maintaining relationships with fellow youth ministers, my fellow staff, people I'm on staff with and everything, of just remaining encouraging during this time, that they're facing the same struggles that we are. Because I'm with you, Chelsea. A lot of times I'm like, I don't feel creative enough to be doing a lot of these things. But just feeling that encouragement that we're all facing similar things, but also leaning into your parents. They are the people that are ministering to their students far more hours than we are. They're the ones that have far more information. So leaning into them and really hearing what their student needs. And I mean, you'll have some parents who are like, what my student needs more games, and hear that may truly be what their student needs. I don't know. But what I'm saying is that leaning into your parents and hearing the needs of what your students are and the ways that you can meet those, that will supply a lot of the creativity and a lot of the decisions that you have to make. Mm-hmm. And just being encouraged by them and developing relationships with those parents. This is a great time to develop those relationships, because those will be crucial as you go through your ministry.
Yeah. I mean, all I would add is say, it is so important, even in this season, for us as ministers to remember that we also are called to rest, and we also are called to be cared for. And so it can feel like when there's something so unsettling, like we were talking about in the beginning, things consistently change. It feels like every single day, we make a decision, and then the next day it's like, oh wow, our decision doesn't work anymore. Let's reevaluate all over again. But even in a season like this, it is the rest of Christ that we've been called into. And so God can do more with the 6 days than we can do with 7. If we pause for a time to let our souls rest and to Sabbath, God is not stopping. So we don't have to feel the weight of we're the ones holding it all together for our students, because we're not. And if we try to be the ones holding it together for our students, we will ultimately fail them. Yeah. And so remembering that we have to rest, that you have to give yourself those places. It's natural instinct to keep getting this idea or this vision of when something starts crumbling, if a wall starts to fall in our house, typically what we would do is run towards it and try put our body weight up against it to hold it up, right? Because we don't want to see it coming down. But what if the invitation this season is for us to step back and let some of those walls fall, knowing that God is ultimately the one that's building up our students and building up the house. And so being faithful to the work, doing as much as we can, but not trying to do what we can to keep it normal, but do what we can to faithfully serve the gospel in this moment and rest. Don't neglect resting of what you've been called to, and knowing that we work from the finished work of Christ, not because we're trying to finish the work, so.
That reminds me, as you're saying that, I'll just share this one thing that's been really helpful for me, and then we can go to some of these great questions that we've been getting. But we have a theologian in our church who I greatly respect, and as I was talking with him about just some decisions, just kind of even chatting with him about, what's the right approach with communion? What's the right approach with online? How do we handle this online moment? He said something that just really stood out to me and has stayed with me about, he was speaking specifically, I think, to the communion issue, but it's applied to so many other things, and just said, Chelsea, there is so much loss right now, and we can't possibly mitigate all of that for people. So we have to, in some ways, just acknowledge we're doing our best, of course, to create meaningful new ways of connecting and of ministering to our students, to their families, to our churches. But I think at some level we have to acknowledge, like you were saying, Kendal, that there is just an insane amount of loss right now, more than probably any of us have dealt with in one season like this. Or not more, but just unusual in terms of losses that we've dealt with in the past. And so I think that has freed me a little bit to feel like, okay, like, yeah, it's not my job to make this all okay for my students, as much as I want to rush in and do that. It's kind of like a helicopter parent move, I guess. Like, I just kind of want to make it okay for them. But I think just recognizing there's a lot of loss, we can't make it okay. Like, that has kind of freed me to look to Jesus, I think, and say, you're the only one that can make this okay. And we trust that eventually he is going to do that. He's going to make it all new again. That may not be, we say that's coming soon, and that's a true statement. It may not be soon in the way we think of soon, but that's really our hope. It's not in any one of us to be able to make it all okay. And so that, I don't know, for me, that's just really kind of in line with what you were saying, Kendal. It really freed me to kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, yes, Jesus, I can rest in your gospel because it's not all on my shoulders. Yeah. Well, let's try to answer some of these questions. I don't know. Let's see. We've got a question here from a friend who's on the call. How do you advise youth ministry or youth ministers to prepare if a second wave or another disruption comes? What ways can we be preparing now? What systems can we have in place to adjust if something else, would cause us to be restricted? So thinking about a second wave, I think, is probably realistic in the fall. How are you all preparing? What would you advise other youth workers to do to prepare?
Yeah, I mean, for us, one of the things that we're considering is, like I said, it's been really big for me to not talk in terms of normalcy. Like, I'm not trying to get back to normal. We're not trying to go back to normal, because even what we discussed at the beginning, once we get out of this coronavirus time, like, it's not going to look the way that it once did, just by nature of what has happened. And so I think that keeping that in mind has been really helpful as we look towards the fall, because whether or not a second wave does come, I think it's realistic that it could, but our students are experiencing something like right now, all of their schools are trying to make calls, right, of what their school is going to look like for them in the fall. And more than likely, schools are not going to look normal to them, whether there's a second wave or not. They're going to prepare as if there's not, or as if there could be. So I think that preparing for that, even, I love what, like Skyler was saying earlier, what we've done with our adult small groups is we've given them kind of like a liturgy of what to do. So we've encouraged them to meet in small groups, but we also have encouraged them to start meeting in what we're calling discipleship groups. So groups that are smaller, of 3 to 4 people. We did that in the very beginning when our small groups, even 15 to 20 people, was too large to gather. We said, well, then we can do these discipleship groups, 3 to 4, as that should be the first thing that you're able to get back in person with. But we've given them a liturgy that is something simple, that is it's training them, it's catechizing them in how to gather together, even if we can't be in person with a Bible study. How can, if we're not there to give you a curriculum, how can you study the scriptures together? Here's the liturgy that you can use, that this works no matter your setting. So I think for us, is like, when you're thinking about youth, try not to think about how are you getting back to normal, but what is most needed for your students in this season, and what are ways that if there is a second wave, you can quickly shift like what you're doing back into that, like that it doesn't destroy everything again. So when we think about going back to normal, we're trying to rebuild that wall. And if a second wave comes, we're going to recognize that wall is just going to get knocked down again. So how can we not rebuild the wall, but actually lean into the season that we have? What are ways that, even if you start gathering together again, maybe there's certain questions, like Skyler's saying, that you're asking, that you're helping to catechize, that his study could easily be brought into a smaller setting if they can't gather again together in the large. They could continue it in their smaller settings. What are opportunities? So I think that's kind of what we're thinking through and how we're asking those questions.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's try to field one more of these. What are some, I think this is such a thoughtful question. What are some policies such as child safety, privacy, social media, et cetera, revisions or adjustments that a church might need to look at during this time, given that, we're probably not approaching normalcy as we've known it anytime soon. We're kind of in this new normal. What revisions might we need to make?
Yeah, I would need to maybe ask what specific policies you kind of had in mind there during that question. But I do think some of the policies, like if you're just talking about pure safety in regards to coronavirus, I mean, some of the things we're keeping in mind is really, I mean, we try to be as cautious as we can be to serve those who need the caution more than others, to maintain distance, to especially for inside, to please wear a mask. But for the most part, we're meeting outside because we really believe that is the safest thing to do. In regards to like child safety, privacy, social media, some of those things, I think you got to maintain the policy that you already had. If you didn't have a policy, this is probably a really great opportunity to take time to review your church's safety policies, to institute things for, forms that your youth workers need to sign, to really make sure that we're protecting our students. So that's the same kind of policies that we would normally have of, we can't meet or touch or anything like that, but putting in those policies now for what is appropriate and inappropriate touching, or what are ways to be safe, and making sure as students are, if they're going to the bathroom or something. So I don't know if those are the policies you're thinking of. That's where my brain goes whenever you mentioned child safety policies. But like I said, or privacy, for instance, if you have making sure that your students' families are okay. If you post a picture of their Zoom, there we go. We got some more information on it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the digital safeguards. I think that's a great point.
Okay.
I would say, I think we were kind of we're just trying to sort of react and make things happen in the spring. And one of the advantages of this next season is that we can be a little more thoughtful about it, hopefully. So that's something I've been thinking about, and I think, Kevin, you might have addressed it a little bit on his video about how to do Zoom youth group. So you could search for that on the Rooted site. He had a great video that kind of walked you through the technical side, but he also did mention, I believe, the privacy concern that maybe we need to add into our forms for this coming year. Most of us do those in the fall, something about permission to meet electronically, permission to meet on Zoom, and we don't usually record those calls, so that's not so much of an issue. But
I would say, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just think it's, again, communication with parents, like that standard needs to be even higher, I feel like, in this season, because of just the nature of where the meetings are going to be happening. But then like we've been talking about and considering, like, what does it look like to retrain even our leaders in what is safe and what is not online, because it's different than the training that they have received. Like we've talked about a little bit, but we've never trained via Zoom of what's good and bad. So thinking about those things.
Well, yeah. And I would say, in regards to Alvin, with a little more clarification there, is, I think we absolutely do need to guard and have specific policies, because if we leave it vague in general, then it's going to end up being confusing, and people are going to do things that they didn't know they were. So I would suggest record any Zoom you do with a student, even if it's one-on-one, to have that, so that if anyone requests it, if anyone thinks, it's just an accountability for both you and the student, that I think you should record every Zoom you do with your students. But also, you asked about certain firewalls or technical aspects. I don't think you could necessarily require certain firewalls, because certain people might not have access to such things or be able to afford such things, but you could at least make your Zooms private, where they have to have a password to join, so that you avoid, people joining that shouldn't be joining, which I know is an issue. Right when we first started, when no one knew anything about what to do, there were some issues with churches and ministries where people were hijacking calls and stuff like that. Those are some of the things that I think, look at Kevin's video and stuff like that. He addresses a lot of those things. But if you have ideas yourself, I'd love to see them in the chat and everything.
Yeah, that's great. So we've got one more question here I want us to try to answer. And as we do that, if you all would feel free to just type any ideas that you have that you want to share, and we can read those out loud if you don't want to raise a hand and say them yourselves. But we really would love to have collaboration from you and just a think tank here in just the couple minutes that we have left. So please feel free to get busy in the chat and share some of those. We can read them off at the end. But we have one other question here in regard to the liturgies that Kendall mentioned, which my ears perked up at that too. I'm like, yeah, where can I get this liturgy? And this participant says, we too are finding it essential to equip students to read on their own and in smaller groups, and something that our founder and chairman, Cameron Cole, has talked about a lot, doing more one-on-one discipleship in this time. So this person asks, are such liturgies and reading plans available in any form? So Kendall, if you know of anything you could recommend, or Skyler, or if you can share yours maybe with us, that would be great.
I would say I could probably share at some point. We have ours written down and in a format. So we use the idea, and I know a lot of churches talk about head, heart, hands. We actually use head, heart, soul, hands, like the holistic kind of view. And so our liturgy goes through there with using like the head scriptures, and we have specific questions you would ask there, going to the heart, asking some more of those accountability questions there, application, soul over to how those things are applying, like how the scripture answers the things we've talked about in the heart, and then going to the hands of praying towards one another and how we take that to others. So I could share that at some point. I was looking up at my bookshelf. I don't think I have it up there, but there is a book that's called One-on-One by David Helm that's talking specifically about one-on-one discipleship. And it's a great resource because it does give you specific questions to ask in using different methods. So it gives you 2 different types of Bible study methods that have questions. And so you could easily copy those questions and give them to students as they're reading through, either one-on-one or in small groups as well.
That's great. So, and I see that Skyler just shared the practical tips for doing digital ministry, part 2 and part 1 and part 2 from Kevin Yee, who's our video guru and just really awesome with all this film stuff. And it gave me the confidence that I could actually do it. I don't know about you guys. So, and maybe what we can do is, Skyler and Kendall, if you all would share, if you just would kind of think back anything that you shared, a specific resource today, and maybe what we can do is try to link those in the resources tab, like on the post that we end up creating for this recording. And that way people could circle back to it and get access to some of those. That would be great. Okay, maybe this one last question. I keep saying that, but these are just so good, y'all. We really want to get to your questions. So, and then we probably need to wrap up here, but we have this question about how are you chiefly communicating with your students? Email, text, phone, Facebook, Insta, Snapchat. This is a great question. I personally have found it overwhelming to try to, normally we have our program times where we have lots and lots of students coming and we get kind of an all for one moment where we see them, we get to engage with each of them, kind of hear a little bit about what's going on in their lives. It's all just really organic and natural. And now we're having to almost do push communication where we're reaching out to them individually or in smaller groups. So what are you all using primarily for those interactions?
Yeah, so we've mostly text, but again, for safety issues, I really try to text them in groups and everything. I really want to be careful about suggesting that you just text them one-on-one. Snapchat is similar. There's just very safety and policy reasons why we don't necessarily practice Snapchatting students and everything, because there's very low accountability for what can be shared there. So I would suggest caution in that area. But yeah, social media like Facebook, Instagram, that may be commenting, sharing videos. But generally we would try to do those things in group settings. Email, I've done a lot of email communication with the students' parents and text communication with students' parents. But we've of course Zoomed as a group a lot of times. But as we mentioned before, we've also started to meet in person.
Yeah, I think that we've been doing a lot of video communication, even though I know people are Zoomed out. Instead of just sending for parents and then for our adults, instead of just sending an email, we've been sending making quick videos and attaching it to the email so that it's easier to watch. But I will just say, although I haven't been communicating with students as much in this season, one of the things that my old student ministry is doing is taking advantage of like Instagram TV and doing Instagram like stories more for mass communication. Students are still on there. We just, as a policy, because of things that we had seen, we just didn't do Snapchat at all. But students were still picking up communication easier in this season. I just was talking with one of the youth pastors through Instagram, and doing Instagram TV, and I feel like that's where they're getting a lot of information. So that's, for students, has been really helpful for them. And then for adults, we've done email.
And a friend here is recommending a service called, I think it's called Messagebox, msgbox.com is a great SMS platform because it archives all the conversations without any editing and is done via phone number, your office number. So maybe something to check into. You've used that, Skyler?
No, I said thank you. Thanks for the sharing.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. Yeah. Well, y'all, this has been so delightful. We hope that those of you who have joined us live today have found it really helpful. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer every single question, but hopefully we got to the majority. We are just really grateful for your participation with us and your presence here today, and hope it was helpful. We'll try to link the resources again when we post this video or podcast, whatever it ends up being, maybe both. But let me just pray to close us out. And we just really value your time and are so thankful. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much for this opportunity today to gather and to spend time together, just really talking about what ministry could look like in each of our contexts this summer ahead. We thank you for the warmer weather in most of our areas that is allowing us to meet outside and hopefully more safely. And we just really pray for each student that's represented by each youth worker who's here, Lord, that you would help them to see clearly who you are through your word, through the community of your church, and through their shepherds, Lord. We pray that you would just really be at work to communicate the gospel of grace, that students would know that you have saved sinners through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's him that we proclaim. It's him that we want our students to know and love and cherish and follow all the days of their lives. And so we pray, even in these difficult times in our world, Lord, with racial injustice, with the coronavirus, that you would be at work to draw many students to yourself, and that you would help them to cling to you when things are difficult. So thank you for this time we've had together. Thank you for these friends. And we just pray that you would bless them as they go about the rest of their days and the work that you've given them to do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, thank you so much, friends. Skyler and Kendal, it's a treat to be with you all.